The man on the range had been shooting for 22 years, and he was absolutely certain the woman behind him couldn't do what she'd just claimed. Master Sergeant Dolan Webb had heard a lot of things in his career. He had heard recruits brag about kills they hadn't made and distances they hadn't cleared. He had heard officers with soft hands and clean boots talk about operational realities they had read about in briefing rooms. He had heard all of it, and he had learned to recognize the specific quality of a lie told by someone who didn't yet understand how much they didn't know. What he hadn't heard in 22 years was a woman standing at the intake desk of the 3rd Special Forces Group's advanced marksmanship cadre in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in civilian clothes, with a duffel bag and no escort, tell him she could calculate a first-round hit at 400 meters in wind conditions that had already turned back 3 of his best shooters that morning. He looked at her for a moment. She didn't look away. Her name was Vera Stanton. She was 31 years old. She stood 5'6" with a kind of stillness that some people develop through discipline and some people are simply born with. She had dark eyes and a way of holding her hands loose at her sides, not performing calm but genuinely in it, that Dolan Webb, who had spent 2 decades reading men under pressure, found genuinely unsettling. Not because she seemed dangerous, because she seemed completely unimpressed with the fact that everyone in the room was looking at her. He told her the 10 a.m. range slot was closed. She told him she'd been assigned to it. He told her that wasn't possible. She handed him a set of orders signed by Brigadier General Roy Ashcroft, copied to Fort Bragg Command, and a separate authorization from the Joint Special Operations Command that he had to read twice because the clearance level on it didn't match anything he'd been briefed about. He read it a 3rd time. Then he looked at her again. She was looking at the range. He said, "Follow me." The advanced marksmanship cadre at Fort Bragg was not a glamorous facility. It was functional in the way that things built for serious purpose are functional. No decoration, no excess. Every surface chosen for durability and utility. The outdoor range stretched across a shallow valley where the terrain dropped and rolled in ways that created variable wind conditions almost year-round. Conditions that the cadre used deliberately because the point was not to give shooters an easy environment. The point was to give them a real one. Dolan Webb ran the cadre with a staff of 6 instructors, all of them men, all of them with at least 15 years of operational experience, all of them currently standing in a loose cluster near the equipment locker and watching the woman walk across the range with the quiet attention of people who have been surprised by something and are still deciding what to do about it. The morning had not gone well. The cadre was in the middle of a qualification cycle for a unit that had been fast-tracked through pre-deployment training, and 3 of the shooters scheduled for the long-range station had failed to complete their qualification rounds. The wind off the valley had been unpredictable since dawn, shifting direction in intervals that weren't consistent enough to calculate from pattern alone. It required real-time adjustment, the kind that came from feel and experience, and a specific quality of mathematical intuition that Dolan Webb could identify in a shooter after watching them take approximately 2 rounds. Most people didn't have it. He introduced Vera Stanton to his staff the way you introduce a problem you haven't solved yet, briefly and without enthusiasm. "This is Stanton. She's attached to the qualification cycle, joint authorization." He held up the orders. His senior instructor, Chief Warrant Officer Brennan Holt, looked at the orders, then at Vera, then back at Dolan. Holt was the kind of man who communicated most of what he thought through the specific degree of expressiveness he allowed his face, which was currently set to 0. That was informative. Vera said good morning. Nobody said it back right away. One of the younger instructors, a staff sergeant named Kyle Pruitt, who had the wide-open face of someone who hadn't yet developed the professional distance that years of operational work installed, looked at her like she was a math problem he hadn't been given enough variables to solve. That afternoon, Dolan Webb pulled her assignment file. Not the orders, the actual file, the one that took him 20 minutes and 2 calls to personnel to partially access because significant portions of it were classified at a level he didn't hold. What he could read told him the following. Vera Stanton had been attached to a classified sniper development program called Project Meridian for 4 years. Project Meridian had been discontinued 18 months ago, following an evaluation that Dolan could find no results for, only the termination notice. Before Meridian, she had 2 deployments, one in a support role and one that was redacted entirely except for the location. Afghanistan, Paktika Province, 2019. She held a graduate degree in applied mathematics from a university that Dolan had to look up because he had never heard of it, which turned out to be a small technical college in Vermont that had produced, according to its website, a disproportionate number of people working in fields he couldn't read about publicly. She had qualified on 11 different weapons platforms. Her marksmanship scores, the ones that weren't redacted, were the highest he had ever seen recorded in any file he had ever read. There was a note at the bottom of the accessible section, a single line added by a name he didn't recognize. She already knows. She's waiting for the right situation to prove it. He read that line 3 times. He put the file down. He thought about the wind on the range that morning. The qualification cycle was scheduled for 5 days. The shooters who had failed that morning were given secondary slots. The unit's command had made it clear, not subtly, that the qualification results would affect deployment timelines, and that there was institutional pressure on the cadre to produce results without compromising standards, which was the kind of thing that sounds reasonable in a briefing room and becomes genuinely complicated on a range in November with a 15-mile-per-hour crosswind that kept changing direction. Vera showed up the next morning before anyone else. Dolan found her at the long-range station when he arrived at 0545, sitting cross-legged on the ground behind the shooting position with a small notebook and what appeared to be a handheld weather instrument, writing something in a way that suggested she had been there for a while. She wasn't in the position. She wasn't touching the rifle. She was watching the valley. He stood behind her for a moment and said nothing. She said, "The wind's been rotating counterclockwise since about 0430. It'll shift again around 0800 when the temperature inversion breaks. After that, it stabilizes for about 40 minutes before the valley effect kicks in from the south." He looked at the valley. He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I've been watching it." She turned a page in the notebook. "Also, the grass in the second depression tells you the bend pattern changes about 8 seconds before you feel it at the position." "That's enough," he said. "Enough for what?" She said, "Enough to not miss." He almost said something else. Then he didn't. He walked back to the equipment room and started the morning coffee and thought about 8 seconds of grass bend that he had never in 22 years thought to look at. Chief Warrant Officer Brennan Holt was the first member of the staff to formally push back. He did it the way experienced military professionals do, through procedure and paperwork and scheduling, not through anything direct enough to be addressed head-on. He assigned Vera to the short-range administrative station for the first 2 days of the qualification cycle, which was technically within his authority as range officer, and was also obviously a way of keeping her away from the long-range work where the actual evaluation pressure existed. She didn't complain. She ran the administrative station with the kind of quiet efficiency that annoyed people who were waiting for her to be difficult, because she gave them nothing to work with. She logged the qualification rounds, maintained the range clearance protocols, calibrated the scoring system, and found 2 data entry errors in the previous cycle's records that had been affecting the aggregate scoring metrics for the past 3 months. Holt found this information on his desk on the second afternoon. He read it once, set it down, picked it up again. His expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic that was producing an answer he didn't want. On the 3rd morning, one of the qualifying shooters, a young sergeant named Trace Kellner from a Ranger battalion, failed his second attempt at the Fulton 800-meter station. The wind had shifted mid-sequence, and he had adjusted incorrectly, and the error was the kind that came from not feeling the air rather than not knowing the theory. He knew the theory. Dolan had watched him run the equations. The problem was that the equations were right, and his read of the conditions was wrong, and at 800 meters, the difference between those 2 things was a miss. Vera was at the short-range station when this happened. She watched the sequence from 200 yards away, without appearing to watch it at all. After Kellner logged the miss and walked back to the staging area, with the particular posture of a man trying not to show what a miss at that range costs him internally, she said something to Pruitt, who was working beside her. Pruitt looked at her. Then he looked at the range. Then he went to find Holt. Holt came to the short-range station. He stood where Vera was standing and said, "Pruitt says you have something." She said, "The wind signature is different at the feet 800 position than the instruments show. There's a thermal layer about 60 feet off the deck that's refracting the air column in the final 400 meters of the flight path. It's not in the weather data because the sensors are positioned too low to pick it up." Holt said, "That's not," he stopped. She said, "I can show you where it is in the data if you look at the projectile deviation patterns across the last 8 qualification attempts. The miss isn't random, it's consistent. It's the same drift, same direction, same magnitude. That's not wind variation. That's a structural effect." Holt looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Show me." She showed him. It took 40 minutes and a legal pad and a data printout from the scoring system, and by the end of it, Holt was quiet in the way that people get quiet when they've been looking at something for a long time and have just understood what they were actually seeing. He didn't thank her. He didn't say she was right. He put the legal pad down and said he'd look at the sensor placement. He did. He repositioned 2 sensors that afternoon. Kellner passed his qualification round the following morning. The moment the situation shifted for real happened on day 4, and it didn't happen because of a dramatic confrontation or a formal evaluation or anything that could be entered cleanly into a report. It happened because of a phone call. Dolan Webb took it in his office at 1400 hours. The number was from Bragg Command, and the voice on the other end was a colonel named Raymond Ashby, who was the kind of officer Dolan had encountered twice before in his career. The kind who called in the middle of a qualification cycle about something that wasn't the qualification cycle. Ashby had a flat, precise way of speaking that suggested he had not called to be corrected and was not expecting to be. He said, "The qualification results for the unit need to be filed by Friday." He said, "I understand there have been complications." He said, "The evaluation committee for Phase 2 of the deployment certification is on a fixed timeline, and the cadre's output needs to align with that." Dolan said, "The wind conditions have been operational factors this cycle, and the shooters are working through the." Ashby said, "The shooters need to be qualified by Friday." There was a specific kind of silence that follows a sentence like that. Dolan Webb had been in enough of those silences to know what they meant, and to know that the correct response was not to fill them immediately. He said, "Understood." He hung up. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he went and found Vera Stanton. She was at the long-range station, not behind a rifle, not with the notebook. She was standing at the edge of the position, looking down the valley with her hands behind her back, just watching, in the way she had been watching since 0545 on day 2. Reading the terrain, reading the air, doing whatever the internal processing was that produced the kind of result he was beginning to understand was not beginner's luck or theoretical knowledge. He said, "I have a problem." She turned. He told her about the call, not all of it, but enough, the Friday deadline, the unit timeline, the fact that 2 of the remaining qualification slots were still in question because the shooters couldn't read the valley, conditions well enough to adjust in real time, and the window for getting them there through standard instruction was now too narrow. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You need demonstration shots to recalibrate their read of the environment." He said, "That's not standard protocol." She said, "I know." A pause. She said, "It's also the only thing that will work in 4 hours." He looked at the valley for a moment, then he looked back at her. He said, "Holt won't like it." She said, "Holt repositioned the sensors." He said, "That's different." She said, "Is it?" He thought about that for a moment. In his experience, the things that felt different were often the same thing at different scales. The instinct that told a man to check a sensor because the data felt wrong was the same instinct that told a woman to watch the grass bend for 8 seconds and know where the air was going. The method was different. The underlying red of the world was identical. He said, "One shot, 2,200 meters. I want to see it before I decide." She said, 2,400. He said, "There's a reason I said T200. She said, "I know what the reason is." 2400 is where the thermal layer effect is most visible. If I hit at 2200, you learn that I can hit at 2200. If I hit at 2500, you learn where the air actually is. The shooters need to see the second thing. He looked at her. She held his gaze in that particular way she had. Not aggressive, not challenging, just fully present and completely uninterested in performing something she didn't feel. He said, set up. She set up in 11 minutes. Not fast as in rushed, fast as in efficient, which is a different thing that looks different if you know how to watch. She adjusted the position by 3 inches, repositioned the rear support by 1.5 degrees, spent 45 seconds looking through the optic without touching the turrets, then made 3 adjustments the turrets in sequence, then was still. Holt appeared on the range while she was getting into position. He saw what was happening. His face did the thing it did when it was set to 0, and he walked to where Dolan was standing. He said, "What is this?" Dolan said, "Demonstration shot." Holt said, "She hasn't been qualified on this platform in this." Dolan said, "She's qualified on 11 platforms. It's in the file." He paused. "The temperature inversion is coming down in about 10 minutes. I want to see what she sees before it does." Holt was quiet. At the target end of the range, 2,400 meters downrange, the steel silhouette plate that no one in the current qualification cycle had engaged at that distance was barely visible against the brown of the hillside. In the valley between, the air moved in the layered, unpredictable way it had been moving all week, the way that had cost 3 qualified shooters their rounds, and one of them a deployment slot, and all of them something private and hard. Vera Stanton went still behind the rifle. She watched the grass in the second depression. She watched it for 6 seconds. On the 7th second, she fired. The sound of a round hitting steel at 2,400 meters arrives 2.5 seconds after the shot. The range was quiet enough that everyone on it heard both. The shot and, after the pause that feels longer than it is, the flat, unmistakable ring of impact. Holt said nothing. Pruitt, who was standing at the staging area, turned away from the impact and looked at Dolan with the expression of someone who has just recalibrated something. She cycled the bolt, held the position, watched the valley for a moment, then stood. She didn't look at anyone. She began breaking down the position with the same unhurried efficiency she'd used to set it up. Dolan Webb walked to the target station and confirmed the impact location. Center mass. Elevation adjustment of the kind that corrected for precisely the thermal refractive effect she had described, that the sensors had been missing, that Holt had only half understood until he was looking at it in a data printout on a legal pad. He stood there for a moment at 2,400 meters with the November wind moving through the grass and the sound of the bass somewhere beyond the tree line. He walked back. He said to Holt, "Get Kellner and Torres to the long-range station for 1600. Holt looked at him. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite concession. It was the specific look of a man who has worked very hard to be right about something for a long time and has just encountered evidence he can't comfortably dismiss. He went to get Kellner and Torres. The demonstration session that afternoon was not what Dolan had intended when he told Vera one shot. It became something larger than that because of what happened when she started talking. Not lecturing, she never lectured. She talked the way good instructors talk, which is to say, she watched what Kellner and Torres were doing wrong and described it from the outside in a way that let them see it themselves, which is different from being told, and which is the difference between an adjustment that holds and one that doesn't. She said, "You're both reading the wind at the position. You need to read it at the target. What the air is doing behind the barrel is irrelevant to where the round arrives." Torres said, "You can't read the wind at 2,400 meters." She said, "Not directly, but the terrain tells you. The depression at 900 meters is a turbulence break. The air that comes out and on the other side of it has traveled across open ground at roughly consistent speed. What you watch is the transition zone at the near edge of the depression, not the air at the muzzle." Torres was quiet. He said, "Show me." She showed him. Kellner qualified on the 2,200-meter station that afternoon. Second attempt. Adjusted. His read of the thermal effect was not perfect, but it was better than anything he had produced in the previous 3 days. And the adjustment he made between his first and second rounds of the session was the kind that came from understanding rather than guessing. Torres was still working through it when the lights started to go. Dolan extended the session by 30 minutes. He didn't ask Holt. He told him. Holt said policy is. Dolan said the wind will be different tomorrow. The window is now. Holt looked at the range. He looked at Torres behind the rifle. He looked at Vera, who was standing to the side and watching the valley with the absolute quality of attention she brought to everything, and was not watching Holt at all. He said, 30 minutes. He walked to the edge of the range and stood there with his arms crossed and said nothing else, which Dolan Webb understood as the closest thing to approval that Brennan Holt was capable of producing in this particular situation. Torres hit on his 7th round. Clean, center elevation, the thermal drift accounted for, the read of the depression transition zone, producing the adjustment he needed in the second that mattered. He lay still for a moment after the shot. Then he sat up and looked at Vera. He said, "How long did it take you to learn that?" She thought about it. She said, "The watching part, a few months. The math underneath it, 4 years." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when the answer is larger than they expected and they're deciding what to do with that. The paperwork problem arrived on the evening of day 4, after the session ended and the range cleared, and Dolan Webb went back to his office to file the updated qualification records. It wasn't complicated paperwork. It was the kind of thing that should have taken 20 minutes. The complication was that the qualification credits for the demonstration session, the instruction Vera had run with Kellner and Torres, needed to be logged under a certified cadre instructor identification code, and Vera Stanton did not have a cadre instructor code because she was not officially a cadre instructor. She was classified as an attached specialist, which meant the qualification credits were in a gray area, which meant Colonel Ashby's Friday deadline was now technically achievable, but officially unclear. Dolan sat with that for a moment. Then he went and found Vera in the equipment room, where she was cleaning the rifle she had used for the demonstration shot with the focused, methodical care of someone who thought of this as a normal part of the day. He told her about the code problem. She looked at the cleaning rod in her hand for a moment. She said, "I figured there would be something like this." He said, "You figured." She said, "There's always something like this." She set down the rod. She picked up a patch and ran it through the bore without looking up. Someone does the work, and then there's a procedure that doesn't have a line for what just happened. He said, "I can request a temporary instructor code from Bragg Command. It would take," she said, 2 days minimum. "Probably 3. He said, "Yes." She said, "Friday is in 2 days?" He said, "Yes." She put down the patch. She looked at the rifle for a moment, then at him. She said, "There's a project file from Meridian. It has instructor certification records in it. Cadre level, range qualified, multi-platform." She paused. "I know because I'm the one who completed them. They were certified by the program officer before Meridian was discontinued, and they're in the file, which is classified, but the certifications themselves are transferable." He said, "I can't access most of that file." She said, "I know. But General Ashcroft can." He thought about the orders she'd handed him at the intake desk, the Ashcroft signature, the JSOC authorization. He said, "You came here with that already arranged." She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. She said, "I came here with documentation that anticipated the obstacles. There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment. He said, "How long have you been carrying that file?" She said, 18 months. "Since Meridian closed." She picked up the cleaning rod again. "I knew the work wasn't wrong. I knew the evaluation that closed the program was working from incomplete data." She kept her voice even unhurried, the way she kept everything. "I also knew that arguing about it wasn't going to produce anything useful. So I documented it. I kept every certification, every qualification record, every methodology note, and I waited for the right range." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the November wind was moving through the valley, doing the thing it always did at this hour, settling slightly, the convective mixing that brought the day's layers back toward equilibrium. He'd been watching that pattern for years without fully understanding what it meant. He understood it better now. He called General Ashcroft that evening. The conversation was shorter than he expected. Ashcroft was a man who communicated in the specific economy of someone who has been dealing with complicated situations for long enough to recognize when a situation is actually simple. He said the Meridian certifications are in her record. They've always been transferable. Nobody asked because nobody needed them until now. He paused. Is there anything else? Dolan said, no, sir. Ashcroft said, good. He hung up. Dolan sat in his office for a moment. He thought about the line at the bottom of Vera's file. She already knows. She's waiting for the right situation to prove it. He thought about what it cost a person to carry 4 years of documentation through 18 months of institutional silence. Not with bitterness, not with a plan to punish anyone, but with the patient certainty of someone who understood that the right situation would eventually arrive, and that being ready for it was the entire job. The certification transfer came through the next morning. Holt was in the operations room when Dolan showed him. He read it once, set it down. His expression was controlled in the way it always was, and also in the way it got when something had shifted underneath the control. He said, Meridian. Dolan said, you know it. Holt said, I've heard of it. He paused. The evaluation that closed it was, he stopped. Dolan said, I haven't been able to access the evaluation results either. Holt was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, the specific movement of a man doing arithmetic he's not sure he wants to complete. He said the data entry errors she found. Dolan said yes. Holt said the sensor positioning. Dolan said yes. Another pause. He said she didn't make a thing of it either time. No, Dolan said. She didn't. Holt looked at the certification paperwork. He looked at it for a long time. He said the committee for Phase 2 evaluation. They arrived Monday. 3 people, one of them is Colonel Dorning from JSOC Training Oversight. Dolan said, I know. Holt said, Dorning was the officer who closed Meridian. The operations room was very quiet. Dolan said, I know that too. Holt looked up from the paperwork. His expression had moved from zero to something else. Something that wasn't warmth exactly, but was adjacent to it. The expression is of a man who has been certain about something for a long time, and is beginning to understand that his certainty was occupying the space where better information should have been. He said, she knows Dorning's coming. Dolan said, she knew before she walked through the door. The qualification cycle completed on Friday morning. Kellner and Torres both passed. The full unit's results came in above threshold for the first time in the cadre's records for a November cycle, with valley conditions above 12 miles per hour. Dolan filed the paperwork at 1100 hours and sent the copy to Bragg Command and the copy to Ashcroft, and felt, in the quiet of his office afterward, something he hadn't felt clearly since the qualification cycle began: certainty. Not about the paperwork, about what had actually happened on that range over 5 days. He went to find Vera. She was at the long-range station. Not behind a rifle, not with the notebook. She was standing with Pruitt, who was asking her something that she was answering with the patient specificity that characterized everything she said, and Pruitt was listening with the quality of attention that young instructors bring to conversations that are quietly rearranging their understanding of something they thought they already knew. She saw Dolan coming and said something brief to Pruitt, who nodded and moved off. Dolan said, the results are filed. She said, good. He said, Dorning arrives Monday. She said, I know. He said, you've been ready for this for 18 months. She looked at the valley. The wind was doing what it always did mid-morning, the predictable settling before the valley effect came in from the south. He could see now, without being told, the bend in the second depression grass, the slight difference in the movement pattern that told you where the air was going before you felt it at the position. She said, longer than that. I've been ready since the evaluation was filed. Since I knew the methodology wasn't wrong, just unseen. She paused. There's a difference between something that failed and something that wasn't understood yet. He said, Dorning's going to come in looking for confirmation of what he already decided. She said, I know. He said, what are you going to show him? She turned and looked at him. Direct, steady. The expression of a person who has spent a long time in rooms where being right wasn't enough and has made her peace with doing the work anyway. She said, I'm going to show him a range where the shooters understand why they hit. Not just that they hit. She paused. There's a difference between a qualified shooter and a shooter who knows what they know. One of them passes the evaluation. The other one is useful in a place where the conditions aren't what the range looked like. He looked at her for a moment. He said, I'm going to be in that evaluation. She said, I know. He said, what do you need from me? She said, what you've already done. He thought about that. About the extension he'd called on Thursday without asking. About the certification he'd requested Friday morning. About the choice on day 2 to stand behind her in the dark at 0545 and say nothing and just listen. He said, I'll tell you now what I should have told you when you walked in. She waited. He said, I heard about Meridian. I know what the evaluation said. I looked at the methodology notes, the ones I could access before you arrived. He paused. I thought they were right to close it. She looked at him. He said, I was wrong. It wasn't a long statement. It wasn't decorated. Men like Dolan Webb didn't make long decorated statements about being wrong. They stated the fact, and they meant it, and the absence of anything surrounding it was the point. She said the methodology wasn't closed. It was delayed. He said, yes. She said, that's what I've been saying for 18 months. He said, I know. She turned back toward the valley. He stood beside her for a moment. The November air was cold and clean, and the second depression grass was bending in the way it always bent before the thermal inversion broke, the way she had noticed on day 2, the way he now understood he had been looking past for longer than he wanted to think about. She said, Kellner. He said, what about him? She said, he's going to be a very good shooter in 4 years if someone keeps pushing him toward the environmental read rather than the theory. He's got the instinct. He just doesn't trust it yet. Dolan said, I'll keep that in mind. She said, you should. He's going to be useful somewhere that matters. He thought about that. About what it said that she was already thinking about the shooters she would never see again. About what it said about the kind of work she was actually doing, which was not about this range or this cycle or this evaluation, but about the longer thing, the slow and unremarkable and absolutely essential work of building something in people that would still be there when no one was watching. Monday morning, the Phase 2 Evaluation Committee arrived at Eero 800. Colonel Dorning was a tall man with the kind of bearing that came from being right in high-stakes situations over many years and having that correctness acknowledged consistently. He moved through the cadre facility with the measured efficiency of a man conducting a review he expected to conclude quickly and without complication. He saw Vera at 081. He stopped in the doorway of the operations room. She was at the whiteboard, walking Kellner and Torres through a wind-read analysis of the previous week's qualification data. Her handwriting precise on the board, her explanation moving from the tactical detail to the mathematical underpinning to the practical implication in a sequence that was both rigorous and completely clear. Kellner and Torres were leaning forward with the quality of attention that people bring to information they can actually use. Dorning said, Stanton. She turned. She said, Colonel. He looked at the board. He looked at her. He looked at Dolan Webb, who was standing to the side and who, at this particular moment, was doing nothing at all except looking back. He said, you're running instruction. She said, qualification support. The cadre ran instruction. He said, Meridian was closed. She said, yes, sir. He said, the methodology evaluation. She said, I have the full documentation from the Meridian program, sir, including the original methodology files, the qualification records from all 4 years of the program, and the incident reports from the evaluation. She paused. All of it. Dated, time-stamped, certified. She held his gaze. If the committee would like to review the documentation, I can provide it immediately. The operations room was very quiet. Dorning looked at her for a long moment. He was the kind of officer who did not let his face break open, who had learned over decades that expressiveness in positions of authority was a vulnerability. But something shifted in his eyes, something real and small and specific, the shift of a man who has arrived expecting to find one thing and has found another, and is still in the process of understanding what the difference means. He said, bring me the documentation. She said, I have it here. She opened a folder that had been sitting on the side table since before the committee arrived. She walked it to him and set it down. He opened it and read for a long time, longer than anyone in the room expected. Dolan watched him read. Holt watched him read from the doorway. Pruitt watched from outside the doorway entirely. Dorning set the folder down. He looked at the qualification results from the previous week. He looked at the board with Vera's wind analysis, still written on it in her precise handwriting. He looked at Kellner and Torres, who were still sitting in their chairs and had gone very still in the way that junior people go still when something large is happening above their pay grade. He said, "The cadre results this cycle." Dolan said, "Above threshold across the board. First November cycle at those scores in the cadre's recorded history, sir." Dorning said, "In valley conditions above 12 miles per hour." Dolan said, "Correct." Dorning looked at Vera. He said, "The meridian evaluation, the closure report." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I read it as a methodology failure." He said it the way a man states a fact he is in the process of revising. An operationally unproven approach that introduced variables not compatible with the evaluation framework. She said, "The variables were compatible. The evaluation framework wasn't measuring the right things." A pause. He said, "You've been saying that for 18 months. She said, "Longer than that. I've had the documentation for 4 years. He looked at the folder again. He looked at it for a moment without picking it up. He said, "I owe you a conversation I should have had before closing that program." She said, "I'd rather have the conversation now." He looked at her. Something in his expression that had been careful and controlled shifted into something else. Something that people who only controlled things for professional reasons sometimes allowed themselves in the moment when the arithmetic became undeniable. He said, "The committee will need 3 hours." Dolan said, "The range is available." Dorning said, "I want to see the long-range station." He paused, and his voice had something in it that hadn't been there at 081. Something that suggested the review he had expected to conclude quickly and without complication had become something different. Something that would take longer and produce a different kind of result. "I want to see it the way she's been running it." That afternoon, while Dorning and the committee ran their range assessment and Holt walked them through the week's qualification data with the careful specificity of a man who had decided that the most useful thing he could do was present the truth clearly, Vera was at the long-range station, not demonstrating, not instructing, just standing at the edge of the position and looking down the valley. Dolan walked up beside her. She said, "He's going to recommend reinstatement." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "He's the kind of man who says he owes you a conversation. Those men follow through." He thought about that. She said, "It won't be fast. These things never are. There will be a formal review process and an institutional assessment and probably 2 committees and a timeline that moves in the way that institutional timelines move." He said, "Months." She said, "At least." She watched the valley. The grass in the second depression was doing the thing it did at this hour, the predictable late afternoon settling. But she'll be back. The methodology will be back. She paused. The work doesn't go away just because the institution didn't understand it yet. He said, "You sound very certain." She said, "I've had 18 months to think about it." He stood beside her for a moment. He said, "I've been running this cadre for 6 years." She said, "I know." He said, "In 6 years, I've never looked at the grass in that depression and understood what it was telling me." She said, "You were looking at the muzzle." He said, "Yes." She said, "Most people do." He said, "That's not." She said, "It's not a criticism." She turned and looked at him. "It's just where the instrument is. The instrument tells you what's happening at the instrument." She paused. "The environment tells you what's happening in the space between the barrel and where you need the round to go. You can't learn that from the instrument. You have to go looking for it somewhere else." He thought about that for a long time. Later, after the committee had finished their range assessment, and Dorning had shaken Dolan's hand and said something quiet and specific about the qualification fault results that Dolan would think about for weeks afterward, and after Holt had put the range equipment away with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, and after Pruitt had asked Vera 3 more questions about the thermal layer effect and written the answers down, with the earnest focus of someone who intended to keep them, Dolan found himself alone in the operations room, looking at the board where Vera's wind analysis was still written in her careful handwriting. He looked at it for a while. She appeared in the doorway at some point, duffel bag over her shoulder, and said she'd be leaving in the morning. He said, "You came here for this. 1 week." She said, "The situation needed 1 week. That's what I came for." He said, "Where are you going?" She said, there's another cadre. Different conditions, different platform, same methodology. She paused. Same problem. She almost said something else. Then she said, the Meridian work doesn't stop because one program ended. It just keeps moving to wherever the right conditions are. He said, and the documentation. She said, I have copies. She met his eyes. I always have copies. He held her gaze for a moment. He said, you walked in here 5 days ago and nobody came to meet you. She said, I know. He said, that was a mistake. She said, it usually is. He wasn't sure if she meant it about this base or about something larger. He thought probably both. She said good night. She walked out. He stood in the operations room for a while after, in the quiet of the building, settling at the end of a day, and thought about something she had said on day 2 at 0545, in the dark of the range before anyone else arrived. The bend pattern changes about 8 seconds before you feel it at the position. That's enough. 8 seconds. In 22 years, he had never thought to look for 8 seconds. He had been looking at the instrument, the muzzle, the reading at the position, the number on the sensor, the data in the format the system was built to collect. He had been looking at all the right things in all the wrong places, and the grass in the second depression had been doing what it always did. Every morning, every afternoon, every time the wind changed. Telling the truth quietly to anyone who thought to look. She had thought to look. She had always been looking. In the morning, the duffel bag was gone, and the operations room had a new notation on the whiteboard underneath the wind analysis, added sometime in the night in the same precise handwriting. The environment doesn't change for the shooter. The shooter has to change for the environment. That's the whole thing. That's always been the whole thing. Dolan Webb read it at 0545 before anyone else arrived. He read it twice. Then he picked up a marker, and for the first time in the cadre's 6-year history under his command, he wrote it onto the permanent instruction board where it could not be erased between cycles, where the next group of shooters would see it before they ever walked to the position, where it would be there, doing its quiet work, long after the woman who wrote it had moved on to the next range, the next demonstration, the next 8 seconds of bent grass and undeniable truth. He put the marker down. Outside, in the second depression of the valley, the morning wind was already moving through.